Hello, this is the video for Chapter 5, Section 2. Remember, Chapter 5 is about populations, and this section, Section 5.2, is going to talk about limits to growth. Remember to fill in your interactive science notebook notes as we go, and don't forget that you may pause this video at any time if you need to get those notes written down. All right, we're going to start with a little review from section 5.1. This is going to review this. This is not in your notes, but it's just a nice little review for you. First question, what are the characteristics used to describe a population? Remember, those characteristics are geographic distribution, population density, and growth rate. What are the factors that affect population size? We have number of births, number of deaths, and the number of individuals that enter or leave a population. And the last learning objective review question, what is the difference between exponential and logistic growth? Well, remember, exponential growth occurs when the individuals in a population reproduce at a constant rate, causing a quick spike at the end, and that is the graph that looks like a J. And then you have logistic growth, which is where a population's growth slows or stops following a period of exponential growth. That's going to be the one that looks more like an S, where you get that exponential spike in the middle, and then we level off at the top along the carrying capacity. Moving on to this section, section 5.2, the learning objectives for this lecture are going to be identify factors that limit population growth, and differentiate between density dependent and density independent limiting factors. So first of all, what is a limiting factor? Well, a lot of times you get this primary productivity of an ecosystem that can be reduced when there is an insufficient supply of a particular nutrient. Remember, we talked about nutrients before, and when there's not enough of a nutrient in an area, then that becomes a limiting nutrient. And like I said, ecologists call such substances as limiting nutrients. A limiting nutrient is an example of a more general ecological concept, which is a limiting factor. And in the context of these populations, a limiting factor is a factor that causes population growth to decrease. So any factor, anything that happens that causes the growth of a population to slow or stop or even go backwards, this is going to be called a limiting factor. There's two different types of limiting factors that we have. The first one is called a density dependent limiting factor. In a limiting factor, this is a limiting factor that depends on population size. So the population has to be a certain size in order to have this factor affect the population. And when we look at what factors are going to limit our population growth, these density dependent limiting factors include competition, predation, parasitism, which we've already talked about parasitism, and then disease. These density dependent factors operate only when the population density reaches a certain level, like I said before. So usually it has to be a very high level. Factors operate most strongly when a population is large and dense. So a very high population and a lot of an organism that's stuffed into a certain area. They do not affect small scattered populations as greatly. So if there's a lot of resources out there, there's going to be less need for competition. And if there's less resources where there's less food, there's not going to be as much predation, there's not going to be as much parasitism, and when you have a smaller population, you're also not going to get as much disease. So that's why these density dependent factors, they depend on a large population. Competition is that first density dependent limiting factor that we have. And what happens is when a population becomes crowded, then organisms start to compete for food, water, space, and sunlight and other essentials. So they start to compete for those resources. Competition among members of the same species is a density dependent limiting factor. Competition can also occur between members of different species, but this type of competition can lead to evolutionary change. So it starts to change what organisms are out there and what organisms are around if there's a lot of that competition. Over time, then, these species may start to evolve to occupy different niches. So if you have an organism that lives in one area, but the food and resources become scarce, they may move to another area to find their resources and thereby become in competition with the organisms that live in that new area, and thereby they might end up taking over the area and taking over the resources that they need to survive. The next density dependent limiting factor is predation. Populations in nature are often controlled by predation, and you should know about this. This is about the predator-prey relationship. You probably learned about this, in elementary science, about how one organism is a predator and one organism is the prey, and the predator always hunts the prey for food. And this is the regulation of population by predation takes place within a predator-prey relationship and the best known mechanism of population control. So this is going to be the best way to control that population that's out there that's starting to maybe get a little bit out of control. So let's look at parasitism and disease. That's the next density dependent limiting factor. Parasites we talked about in the last chapter, which is when one organism is either living in or on another organism and that organism benefits while the other organism, the host organism, is harmed. So parasites can limit the growth of a population depending on how harmful they are. A parasite is, like I said, lives in or on another organism. This is the host and consequently harms it. Then we need to move on to density independent factors. The density dependent factors before depended on the size of a population, but the density independent limiting factors affect all populations in similar ways regardless of the population size. What type of factors are going to limit population growth with this density independent limiting factors? Examples of these are going to be unusual weather, natural disasters, seasonal cycles, and certain human activities such as damming of rivers and clear-cutting forests. These are going to affect a population in an area no matter what the size of that population. So these things, it doesn't matter how big the population, big, small, medium, whatever, these are always going to affect the population growth, and they're going to limit that growth. So now we have our learning objective review for Chapter 5, Section 2. First review question is, what are the factors that limit population growth? Well, we have two different factors, remember. There's the density dependent limiting factor, and there's the density independent limiting factor. And what is the difference between the density dependent and density independent limiting factors? Well, the density dependent, remember, they only operate when population density reaches a certain level. An example of these factors are going to be competition and the predation. Then the density independent limiting factor, they will affect populations in similar ways regardless of size. And examples of those are going to be weathers, natural disasters, and certain human conditions that can affect as well. These have been your notes for Chapter 5, Section 2. Make sure you get them filled in completely and have them ready to put in your interactive science notebook. Please make sure that you go back, get anything that you missed, pause as you need to, and we will see you later.